Oh, well, that would be awkward for all of us. Although stranger things have gone on in the church before. Let's go to Acts 23. Acts 23. We're going to be looking at God's providence, some examples of that as we go through this. And I think we kind of need to distinguish between, in looking at how God works, we need to kind of distinguish between the miraculous and God's providence. So when we're talking about miracles, an actual miracle is something that goes beyond the laws of nature or the laws of physics. It's something that is outside of the bound. I mean, there's no way to explain it. There's not an equation you can put to it other than the fact that we don't know, other than God did this. You know, when we think of God creating something out of nothing just by his word, that's beyond the laws of physics. People being raised from the dead, people being miraculously healed by the laying on of hands from diseases that would have them crippled or would soon kill them. And they're not gradually healed, they're immediately healed. And there's no explanation for that other than the fact that this is a miracle. We have no explanation for it. But when we talk about providence, we're talking still about God working, but he's working through ordinary means. So if a person's sick and they take medicine and they get better, it's still God working through those means. He is providentially using that to affect somebody to be healed in that sense. But it's not necessarily a miracle because there's biological reasons for that taking place. Because all of us probably know people or have experienced it ourselves where you've been sick or have some sort of ailment or disease and you take a medicine for it and medicine doesn't do anything for it. And that's just simply because God has chosen not to allow that to happen for some reason. And so, you know, we think about times where, maybe you're without money and, you're praying about it and, we need this money, otherwise we're going to be belly up or something like that. Then all of a sudden through the mail, this money just shows up. That's not necessarily a miracle because somebody signed that check and his name wasn't God, right? What that is God's providence. God was working through ordinary means to get somebody else to work to bring that particular thing to pass, which was in accordance with his will. That's providence. And what we see going on here within this passage of Scripture are some examples of God's providence in Paul's life. But before we get into this, let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll get into this portion of Scripture. Father, thank you for this time you've given to us, study your word together. Pray that you bless our time, give us wisdom, help us to appreciate how you work, even in our own lives, as we see how you work here in Paul's life to accomplish your purpose. And so I pray that you'd use this time, pray that we'd be edified, pray that you would use me as an instrument to strengthen your people tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're in Acts 23, and what we're going to find here, we're going to be down in verse number 12. But one of the things that we see over these next several chapters is that Paul is going to be living in constant suspense, as though his life hasn't already been exciting as it is. But he's first going to be the object of a terrorist attack. Then he's going to go to some he's going to go through several court cases that are extremely tense, because he's going to basically go from one high court to the next high court to the next high court, and then finally to the Supreme Court, which is before Caesar himself, the ruler of the world basically at that time. And you can imagine, I would be a little nervous for each of those. There are some confrontations I like, and I'm fine with confrontation on some things, but for the most part, I don't particularly care for confrontation. I get really worked up, and my nerves get and by the time I get done, I'll just be shaking, and I'm just ready to go crawl up in a ball somewhere and just pass out or something like that. But here's Paul, and he's going through all these circumstances, and the whole time he's calm. He goes through it, and for the most part, with a really good attitude. He's courageous because he's trusting God's plan and power. As we think about it, and think about our future, and we think about our own plans, I think every one of us would affirm and say, yes, I believe that God is sovereign, that God is in control. It's easy for us to affirm that. I don't think anybody would just outright deny it, but it's a completely different thing to actually trust Him and His sovereignty and His power in the midst of our circumstances, especially when they look like all the odds are stacked against us. And this is exactly what it looks like here with the Apostle Paul. You remember the 3 men of Israel as they're standing before Nebuchadnezzar getting ready to be tossed to the fiery furnace. And that's pretty intense. And they're bold and courageous right there. Well, be it known unto thee, O king, that our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. But even if He doesn't, we still won't bow. That takes a little bit of courage. You can tell they're trusting God. God is more than capable to deliver us if doing so would accomplish His plan and purpose. And if doing so would not accomplish His plan and purpose, He is free to do away with us, and that's fine. But either way, we're going to trust Him, and we're not going to obey you. And that's pretty bold, but that's exactly where they're at. They're trusting God. They know that God works through these circumstances. Now, notice in your notes, in this passage, we see another example of God's care. Because they're with those three men of Israel, we saw God's care of them, right? Because they were tossed to the fire, and what happened? Absolutely nothing. The ropes got burned off. The people that threw them in burned up. But God was with them in the fire. And here we see another example of God's care for His people. We see how God fulfills His plan by sovereignly, that's referring to His power and His ability, and providentially working to accomplish His purpose. Now, think about it. Remember, the night before this, we're getting ready to go into the next day here from when Paul was, the day prior to this, he's preached to his people. He got to preach to the masses of the Jews there, and they almost killed him, and so he's kind of at a low point. He had the opportunity to preach to his people. That got nowhere. In fact, they almost killed him, almost beat him to death. And then after that, he's taken to the Sanhedrin, and he gets to preach, or at least try to preach to the leaders of his people. What an opportunity that was. Well, and that didn't go anywhere either, and they tried to kill him as well, tried to pull him in pieces. And so the night prior to this, what we're getting ready to go into, Paul's really at a low point. He's discouraged. And as the Lord has done at other low points in Paul's ministry, the Lord comes that evening and stands by him in the cell where he's at. And he says, verse 11, the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified to me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." And so when Paul's there lonely and when Paul's there discouraged, the Lord Jesus comes and he stands right by Paul and encourages him and stands by him. And as we mentioned last week, sometimes it is God's will to take us out of our troubles. Sometimes it is. We get in a hard spot, we pray about it, and God intervenes on our behalf, and it's over and dealt with and done. Man, that's wonderful when that happens. But most of the time, that's not how He's pleased to work with us. Most of the time, He's pleased to allow us to go through our troubles, but He goes with us through them. And that's how He accomplishes His plan. And so right after that, in verse 11, the Lord standing there beside him, but right after that, the Lord then recedes back behind the curtain, so to speak. He kind of goes behind the scenes and begins to work. And He disappears, really, for the next few chapters as He's dealing with Paul. And he returns to using just the ordinary means of influencing things to accomplish his purpose. Kind of as Paul says in Romans 8:28, how many things does he say work together for good? All things. And is that just all good things? No, what is it? It's all things. That's the good, the bad, the ugly, the ordinary. That's all of them. And really, as we go through this passage, we see all of those things. Because here we see that God uses the evil, the ordinary, and the powerful in accomplishing his purpose. So let's notice first, God uses the evil. That's number one. God uses the evil. Now, as Paul's there in his prison cell, and he's chained up, and he's waiting the next day to find out what's going on, he's at his low point. The Lord has come and stood beside him to encourage him. Paul knows it's bad. He knew it was bad. I mean, all of Israel rejected him. As far as he knows, he could be put to death the next day. Paul knows it's bad. But, Paul didn't know how bad it actually was, because it was far worse than he thought. And, whatever it is that we're going through, it's probably worse than we think it is. It's just the reality of it. I mean, that's really encouraging, I know, but it probably is far worse than we can even begin to fathom. Because, and we see this especially with Paul, because Paul's there in his jail cell, and that's pretty bad. He's discouraged. But what he doesn't know is that the next day, there are going to be 40 Jewish men who are going to put themselves under oath to assassinate Paul. So it's worse. Now, while God does not commit evil, and God is not the author of evil, he does work with evil instruments as well as the good ones to fulfill his plan. That's what we have to keep in mind. Because this whole situation here that we're getting ready to read about, this whole situation is evil, and God is using it to accomplish his purpose in getting Paul to Rome. Amos chapter 3, verse 6 says, "Shall the trumpet be blown in the city, and the people not be afraid? Shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord hath not done it?" If evil and harm or war, which is what the context there is in Amos, if war comes to a city, did that catch God by surprise? No, God allowed that to take place because somehow that fulfills his plan. We don't know exactly at the time. We won't know until the end. But somehow God permitting evil to take place accomplishes his plan and purpose. Proverbs 16:4, "The Lord hath made all things for himself, yea, even the wicked for the day of evil." So when we think of the day of evil, what's going to happen the day of evil? Well, evil people, the wicked, are going to be destroyed. That's one way God accomplishes his purpose, because his purpose is to destroy all the wicked eventually. But he also, we can read the book of Revelation. We know God uses wicked men to accomplish his purpose. Look at the book of Daniel. Look at the prophets. How many wicked kings have been raised up in Israel and the nations around that God used in his purpose for Israel? Proverbs 16:9 says, "A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps." You ever make a plan and never get to accomplish it? Alex, I know you don't know anything about that. And you get up in the morning or at the beginning of a week and you say, you know what? Today or this week or this month, I'm going to work to accomplish these projects. And it just seems like something is working against me to prevent me from accomplishing this. Well, the Lord directs our steps. I think sometimes God allows us to make plans just so he can say, you know what? I'm just going to show you who's really in control here. And he has no problem bringing some things into our way. It just really throws a monkey wrench into our plans. It happens. And on a grander scale, when you think of the nations and how that works, you don't think nations have plans of what they're going to do? Well, the Lord directs the steps. The Lord moves the nations around. He sets up kings. He puts them down. He's the one that's in control. And as we get into these passages, looking at the remainder of 23 and getting into chapter 24, these chapters, chapter 24, 25, and 26, are really a lot like the book of Esther. Because in the book of Esther, and this is one of the things that has caused people over the years to question whether Esther should be in the Bible, In Esther, God is not mentioned one time in the book of Esther. It's really kind of interesting. But yet it is so obvious as you're reading through it to see that God is 100% there the entire time, working in all of these details before, after, and even in the midst to accomplish his purpose with the nation of Israel. And this is exactly the way it is with these chapters. God doesn't show up. It doesn't seem like, at least in a spectacular way. But he's there working in all these details to accomplish his purpose. The Lord promised Paul he's going to go to Rome. He promised him, you must be a witness for me in Rome. And then he's going to go behind the scenes to work through all these events to accomplish that purpose. You know, if we're not careful, because as you look through this, there's nothing really spectacular that takes place. It's all ordinary stuff. It's really kind of the mundane day in, day out type of thing that was going on in the Roman Empire at the time. And if we're not careful, it's very easy for us to mistake a lack of the spectacular on the day-to-day. It's easy for us to mistake that for God not working. Just because there's not some type of miracle going on. There's not some sort of big sign in the sky flashing saying that God's working or something like that. And we can look at the mundane and think, well, you know, it just really doesn't seem like God's working, when really he is working. He's just not doing it with a visible sign. He's just working behind the scenes, working in the mundane to accomplish his final and ultimate purpose. He's just working behind the scenes. Notice here verse 12. It says, and when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. That's real nice. I mean, this is exactly what I would expect from a faithful follower of God, right? But I mean, this is kind of the way Paul was prior to his conversion. But now, when we think about it, what exactly did Paul do to deserve such hostility? Well, nothing really, other than the fact that he kept God's law, and he loved the Jewish people, and he preached the gospel to them. That's what all of this is about. He had done nothing against them, nor had he done anything illegal by way of Roman law. So what's going on here? Well, Paul kind of alludes to the situation in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4, where he says, the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. These 40 men, along with really all of Israel, pretty much at the time, were under deep deception. That's the reason they could not understand the truth. That's the reason they would not listen to Paul. They were deceived. And since Satan couldn't prevent Christ from coming into the world, and as you go through the Old Testament, you can see numerous times where Satan has tried at strategic moments in history to try to eliminate the nation of Israel, or even Messiah from coming in other ways. And since Satan was defeated by the work of the cross and the resurrection, now he set his aim on the preachers of the gospel. And this is exactly what's going on. Notice here in your notes, these men, these 40 men that were banded together, were pawns in Satan's match against God. They were falling right into his plan, that's your blank there, to hinder the gospel by trying to eliminate the most influential and effective preacher of the gospel. You know, I think it's interesting because we can obviously see that Satan's at work here. But at the same time, we got to remember, Satan is still God's devil. God's got a leash around Satan, and Satan can't do anything that God doesn't allow for him to do. Remember Job? Satan had to ask God's permission and be told by God what he could and could not do. And so, yes, Satan's after the preachers of the gospel, but still that is within God's plan, and God is still working. And so these men are determined. Notice it says they bound themselves under a curse. They had made a vow to God that they would not eat and that they would not drink until Paul is dead. Now, it kind of makes you wonder, because we know that doesn't happen. They fail in their mission. Did they just kind of starve to death, or what happened to them? I don't know. It just kind of, I wonder if they kind of thought about it afterwards. Maybe this was kind of a rash vow. Maybe the Lord would just kind of be merciful if we... But they had invoked God's curse upon them if they did not fulfill their vow to kill Paul. And the number of them was necessary. There was quite a few of them. There's 40, verse 13 says. There are more than 40, which had made this conspiracy. We don't know exactly how many that is. Probably under 50. Because I think if you be as precise as saying more than 40, if you have the number for 40, you have the number for 50 as well. So it's probably under 50. But since the Jewish mob had been unsuccessful in killing Paul, since there's still no conviction against Paul by the Romans aren't going to do anything at this point. So these 40-plus men get together, and they're going to take matters in their own hands. And it was absolutely necessary for there to be at least 40 of them, given what their plan was. Notice verse 14. And they came to the chief priests and elders. These are the people that Paul had tried to preach to, that tried to pull Paul in pieces the day before. They come to these people, as Ananias is, the high priest, and said, verse 14, we have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore, ye with the council signify to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though ye would inquire something more perfectly concerning him, and we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him. So that's the plot. And you can just see the corruption that's within the leadership here, because they go to the council of Israel, to the priests themselves, and say, we got a plan. And we want you to be a part of this. We're gonna murder Paul, and we want you to play along with us to help us accomplish this. And of course, the chief priest, being among the group of the Sadducees, he's more than willing to help out with this, especially since Paul believes in the resurrection of the dead, more than willing to help. But their plan is to have Paul brought once again to the Sanhedrin, or as though he would come to the Sanhedrin, and on the way, they're going to be hiding out, and as they bring Paul, they're going to jump out and ambush Paul and the Roman soldiers to kill him. So 40 of these men would be necessary, because Paul's going to be guarded by a number of soldiers. They're going to have a number of them, because people are going to die, that's for sure. And so if we got 40 guys, somebody's bound to get through to accomplish this. So at least somebody's going to eat that night. But now notice here in your notes, this is all part of God's plan. Do you think God is caught by surprise when things like this go on? Like, oh my word, they're going to try to kill Paul. What do we do? Hey, anybody got an idea? What do we do with this? Well, maybe if we just kind of try this and see if this works, and maybe if we kind of do this, and maybe we'll just send fire. God's got it all figured out ahead of time. This is all part of God's plan. You remember Joseph? When he was thrown into the pit, God's not sitting back munching on his fingernails. What do we do here? This was the hope of Israel. God had it all figured out. And you notice there, I got Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20 in your notes, because you remember at the end of Genesis there, as Jacob has died, and now the brothers are all afraid, Joseph's going to be mad at us now, and he's going to try to kill us. And this is what Joseph says to his brothers. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God what? Meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. So while his brothers were planning evil, God meant it. That was part of God's plan all along. And while in their free choice to do so, they meant for an evil purpose, God meant to accomplish something great with it. So notice here in your notes, even when evil comes against us, God has allowed it because he is working to accomplish his ultimate goal. his ultimate good. This is exactly what's going on with Paul. Paul, you're going to go to Rome, and you're going to be a witness for me in Rome. Now, how is this going to happen? How am I going to accomplish getting you there? Well, I'm going to set up 40-plus men that are going to try to assassinate you, and I'm going to foil their plan in it. That's how I'm going to accomplish this. Well, that's just awesome. Even when somebody has evil plotted against him, God's already got it figured out, and God has planned that all in order to accomplish his purpose. Secondly, God uses the ordinary. He uses the ordinary. Or D-I-N-A-R-Y. You know, this plot, of course, if you want a plot to work, you want to keep it a secret, but it doesn't stay secret very long. You know, maybe because there's 40 of these guys talking, you know, discussing this thing, somebody comes by and hears it. You know, somebody just happens to be at the right place at the right time. Of course, we don't believe in happenstance, really. But in God's providence, notice what happens, verse 16. When Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. Now, this is really interesting. Where did this guy come from? Well, besides from his mother. But where did he come from? I mean, up to this point, we have heard in the New Testament, there is very little about Paul's family. Very little. This is the most detail we have. We know during his ministry he's not married. We know that from Romans, in chapter 16, verse 7, 11, and 21, there are 3 people named who are called Paul's kinsmen. Maybe that means they're related to him somehow. We don't know exactly for sure. It could be just somebody close to him in the faith. Here we see that he has a sister and a nephew. That's the most we see, the most detail we get. And the fact that there's really no explanation of why the nephew's in Jerusalem points to God's providence here. Why is he here? The hometown is Tarsus. I mean, did they send their kids to Jerusalem for school? Maybe that was a thing. Was he maybe training to be a rabbi? You know, Uncle Paul defected from the Jewish faith, and so I'll go and take his place. And if that's the case, why is he so concerned about his uncle and following him around Jerusalem? Because he knew right where Paul was. How did he hear about the plot? There's a lot of unanswerable questions. I mean, granted, we are only, and this is a possibility too, we are only a week, not even, from Pentecost. So it's possible his nephew was there for Pentecost. All the more reason for Paul to be there on time and just hanging around town for a few extra days. Don't know. But as with Esther, this young man is here for such a time as this. Notice in your notes, this is an example of how God uses even the evil, free choice schemes of men to accomplish his purpose. You know, God's plan is not dependent upon us. God is going to fulfill his plan. And he can use whatever means necessary to accomplish that, even if that means keeping us out of it. So, the nephew happens to be there by God's design, and he hears of this plot somehow. Probably he's a younger man. And it says he's a young man. We don't know exactly how old he is. Probably young enough for them to be talking about this and had to have seen him somehow and think, he's not going to say anything, nobody's going to care what he has to say or anything like that. Not knowing his relation to Paul. But he hears this plan, and he goes right to Paul. I can imagine this would be a little intimidating, because here's a Jewish boy, young man, probably in his early teens, and he's getting ready to go into the fortress where the enemy is, where the Romans are housed, there at the fortress of Antonia, where Paul is being kept in prison, and he's going to go past all these Roman soldiers that are there to go directly to the Apostle Paul to tell him, look, there's an assassination attempt getting ready to be made on your life. I just happened to hear about this. And so, notice verse 17 what Paul does. Then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him. The chief captain, again, being Claudius Lysias. This is the guy that had rescued him from the mob that was trying to kill him both times. Now he's protecting him. He has to babysit Paul. Probably doesn't like that much, but Paul probably calls for one of the soldiers. That he doesn't go directly to Claudius. He calls for one of the soldiers, probably because of Claudius's rank, just to be respectful. But because Paul is a Roman citizen, this request becomes high priority. And so, verse 18, so he, the soldier, took Paul's nephew and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul the prisoner called me unto him and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee. Now, I'm assuming, just because of how the next verse reads, that it's pretty obvious that this young man is intimidated. And that he is probably a younger man and not a full-grown man. Because, verse 19, then the chief captain took him by the hand. And maybe it's just because of our culture. I don't know that if I want to talk to Wayne off to the side, I'm going to take him by the hand. I'll just kind of flag him over, walk with me or something like that. I'm not going to take his hand to do so. That would just be awkward for both of us. But that's what happens here. So as I read this, and I could be wrong, this is just conjecture on my part, that this is probably a very young man. And he's obviously intimidated. And so the chief captain, Claudius Lysias, takes him off to the side to hear what he has to say. It says he took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, What is it? What is that thou hast to tell me? And he said, The Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring Paul down tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more perfectly. Now notice in your notes here, in God's providence, this is being made known for Paul's protection. And so the captain's urged not to fall into the trap. This is a Roman general. I don't know. It's kind of funny, I think. Here's this young man, and he says, now, they're going to come and try to trick you. Don't listen to them. Kid, who do you think you are? You're a Jew. Right? That's how the Romans would think of something like this. So, this is God's working in this situation. Verse 21, But do not thou yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath, that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for the promise of thee. And Lysias obviously sees the seriousness of this situation, so he's going to act immediately. Notice, verse 22, So the chief captain then let the young man depart and charge him, See thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things unto me. Now why would he tell him that? Well, it would be kind of difficult to know when a conspiracy is going on, who can you trust? You got 40 plus Jewish men that have bound themselves to a curse. Apparently they've been talking about it. Who can you trust? That if you go blabbing to somebody, they might just go blabbing to those men. Or you might just accidentally blab to one of those men that you told them. And if their plan gets found out, it's not going to be hard for them to just come up with something else and figure out another way to do it. So he tells them, don't tell anybody. The only way to prevent them from success would be to let them think everything's a go. Everything's going to happen. We're just going to act like nobody knows about this. And under the cover of night, they're going to take Paul somewhere else. And so he takes the necessary measures for travel. But as he does that, the captain is totally unaware that he is an instrument in God's hand to accomplish God's purpose. And now we notice thirdly that God uses the powerful. I mean, that boy is just an ordinary boy, ordinary young man. Nobody even noticed him. He's not even named. Really, apparently, somebody that's so ordinary, nobody noticed him when they're talking about this plan, but he overheard it somehow. And God uses that, but God uses the powerful. Notice here, Lysias is a powerful man. To some degree, he held Paul's life in his hand. And even with his own power, he could not escape God's power. And God uses him as the means of protecting Paul to ensure he gets to Rome. You know, Lysias understands that things are very quickly about to get out of hand. Paul is an innocent civilian. It's his responsibility to make sure that he protects this man. Since he is a Roman citizen, he has to protect him from this assassination attempt. And he knows that he has to get Paul out of town quickly. You know, also, this is going to prevent, by getting Paul out of town, this is going to prevent a Jewish revolt. Because if they go and these 40-plus men come out and try to kill Paul, Romans are going to die. Jews are going to die. And you know who's going to retaliate? Both sides. So, this is not only for the safety of Paul, this is for his own neck, and it's for the safety of all of his soldiers, because he knows this is going to create a war. So he does what any man would do in his situation. Passes him off for somebody else to deal with it. And that's what I would do. It just seems logical. And he wastes no time doing this. Verse 23, he called unto him two centurions, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200 at the third hour of the night. And Caesarea is 65 miles away on the coast of Israel there. That's where Felix is. That's where his headquarters is. That's who Paul's going to be on the next day. Lysias doesn't want to take any chances of some potential ambush. The first half of the journey to Caesarea is real rocky, mountainous, hilly terrain. And so it was well known for bandits to be out there hiding in the rocks, waiting for people to come by unawares and just ambush them. Escaped prisoners would be out there, robbers and thieves and all sorts of things would hide out there. And so it was a very dangerous track, that first half of the journey, the first 30 miles or so. And so he assembles half of his garrison to take Paul. There's 200 infantry, 200 men carrying spears, 70 men on horses. They're the cavalry. And so we saw God using somebody seemingly ordinary, and here we see God using great power to accomplish his purpose. Roman government. Are they godly or corrupt? They're corrupt. Notice in your notes here that God can use even a corrupt government to accomplish his purpose. That's certainly something for us to keep in mind this time of the year, is it not? Given our political situation, and as much as we hate the situation that we're in, and even the situation upcoming, whatever it be, we have to understand that God's the one that sets up people in authority, and he's the one that puts them down. And he uses people to accomplish his purpose. Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord as rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. And if God can control a king, can he control anything else? Absolutely. If he can control the rivers and the paths that the rivers carve out, he can absolutely control nations. He can control governments. He can control people. And so they're not going to wait until morning. Lysias knows better, because if they wait till morning, they're going to be spotted leaving town with Paul. So they wait until the third hour of the night, which would be 9 o'clock p.m. Everything's dark. People are going to bed. People are settling into their homes. This is the time when they can get out of town quietly and without being noticed. And because they're in a hurry, they don't want Paul walking in chains, so they're going to provide an animal for him to ride on. Notice verse number 24. And provide them beasts that they may set Paul on and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. So Felix is the next highest in rank above Lysias. Now, Felix is no saint. And he was a freed slave. He was known to be violent, licentious. He was known to be an ineffective governor. And really the only reason he got to the position that he had is because his brother was high enough up that his brother actually had to hire him because he couldn't do anything else. So his brother hired him to have this position, pulled some strings. And later, he would be recalled to Rome and lose his job because a bunch of riots break out in Caesarea. And I think it's interesting because God worked to elevate a man who was entirely incompetent to a high position as part of his plan to get Paul to Rome. Now, I'm not saying anything at all about our political situation, but we see that God did it here with Felix. He put somebody in charge who was incompetent, and through that, God worked his purpose to get Paul to Rome. Now, Roman law required a letter. If we're going to exchange prisoners, there has to be some sort of letter explaining the reasons here, what's going on, what's been transpiring that's led up to this, so we know when we take this prisoner what to say to the people that we have to take him to. So, verse 25, he wrote a letter after this manner. This is Lysias that writes this. Verse 26, Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. Now, this letter is somewhat accurate in its summary of these events. But of course, Lysias is trying to put his best foot forward to the governor. And so he wants it to sound like he found out first that Paul was a Roman citizen and therefore he rescued him, but that's not entirely true. Despite what he writes, he found out after the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen. And it seems that he had a bout of amnesia, because he just happens to forget in this letter that I am the one who illegally bound Paul on 2 different occasions and even sentenced him to be scourged. I mean, just the details that people just happen to forget on some things. How convenient. Verse 28, he says, And when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to this charge worthy of death or of bonds. Now, this is probably one of the most important points here. When he writes, he has nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. This is one of the chief purposes that Luke writes his gospel and the book of Acts, because he is writing to let people know in general. Theophilus is probably the lawyer that's going to represent Paul in Rome, is what many people think. But the purpose of writing this is to show that Christians are not subversive to the government. Here's the evidence. It didn't start out that way, and it's not continued that way. So Paul's innocent. There's no reason to hold him. That's what Lysias says. And as Paul goes before Felix, as he goes before Agrippa later, he's going to be declared again to be innocent. Lysias has no particular reason to keep him bound, other than verse 30, when it was told me that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. Why, if there's no reason to hold him bound, why is he here? Why is he going to Caesarea? What's the whole point of this? Well, it's kind of like he's saying, well, I was just going to release him, but then I found out that these guys were going to kill him, and, we got to protect the Roman citizens, so I'm giving him to you. I had to get him out of town. He's a Roman citizen. We had to get him out safely. Couldn't let him be harmed in Jerusalem. Verse 31, Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Now, Antipatris, halfway mark. It's about 30 miles from Jerusalem. Now, this would have been quite the hike, because, especially for these foot soldiers, because they make this journey in one night. I can't even imagine. After 5 miles or so, my feet get hurt a little bit. But I can't imagine trying to march for 30 miles straight through, because they have to do this in one night. Yeah, exactly. That's why one of the reasons Paul had to be on a horse. He's in chains. That's going to slow him down a little bit. We can't have that. We got to get there. We got to get there now. So this is no doubt a grueling task for them. Notice verse 32. On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle. So the remainder of the trip, as you leave Antipatris to finish the trip to Caesarea, it's mostly open plains. So there's no place for people to hide. It's a safe, much safer trip. So now the foot soldiers are going to turn around after having marched all night. They're going to turn around now because the danger's passed, and they're going to march all the way back to Jerusalem. The horsemen now are going to take Paul the rest of the way. And so as far as they're concerned, they're transporting a prisoner. That's what they do. They transport prisoners. But really, they're kind of bodyguards. That's how God is using them. They're bodyguards to transport his preacher. And verse 33, he says, who, when they came to Caesarea, delivered the epistle to the governor, which is Felix, and presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. So this is to determine jurisdiction. Why is he here? Is he under my jurisdiction even? And he was, because, verse 34, when he understood that he was of Cilicia being southeastern Turkey, there were Tarsuses. Cilicia and Judea being under the governorship of Syria, Felix has the authority to judge Paul. So he says, verse 35, I will hear thee when thine accusers were also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. Now this begins a 2-year period of confinement. Paul's going to be in Caesarea for 2 years. And then after that, he's going to go to Rome, and he's going to be in Rome for 2 years as he awaits trial before Caesar. But remember, verse 11, Paul was promised by Jesus he must go to Jerusalem. And all through this, God shows his care by providing a safe passage for Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and he provides great accommodations when he's there. Paul is staying in Herod's judgment hall. This was known throughout history as Herod's Praetorium, and this was the place where the Romans were stationed in Caesarea, and it was right on the beach. Paul's really got it luxurious here while he's there. See, Paul's experiencing exactly what Peter tells us, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. And whether God uses evil men, whether God uses a child, whether God uses the Calvary, whether God uses ordinary means or evil means, he is in charge the entire time. And while our day-to-day certainly may not look spectacular, we can rest assured that God is, in fact, involved. Remember Job? Job says, I look ahead of me. I don't see God working there. I look to my right hand. I don't see him there either. Behind me, he's not there. In the left hand, I know he's working, but I don't see him there either. He says, but he knows the way that I take, and when he has tried me, I will come forth as gold. And so that's exactly where Paul is. Paul knows there's nothing spectacular going on here. This is all very ordinary stuff. This is common day-to-day stuff going on within the Roman Empire. But yet God is working to accomplish his plan, even though none of it looks spectacular. And so like Paul, we can trust God, even in the most difficult and trying times, knowing that he which hath begun a good work in us will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. All right. Let's go ahead and take up some prayer requests.